Okay, interesting question. Number 4, were the Jewish Christians expected to keep the law of Moses? And the questioner actually goes on to say, especially before, well, not only before the cross, but after the cross as well. Were the early Jewish Christians expected to keep the law of Moses? Well, of course, before the cross, they were. Before the cross, there were no Jewish Christians. And so Jews, before the cross, of course, they were expected to keep the law of Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 27 and verse 26, cursed be anyone who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them. So yeah, before the cross, Jews were expected to keep the law of Moses. Now, how about Jewish Christians after the cross, after Acts chapter 2? Were they expected to keep the law of Moses? Well, that gets into a discussion that the book of Acts especially goes into some detail about. There was, of course, a 40-year period from Acts chapter 2, which would be AD 30 approximately, to the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70, about 40 years. That was a very interesting period of history. I've always said that I feel sorry for the Jewish nation in general and Jewish Christians in particular during that time, because that was a struggle. That was a hard time to be a Jew, because you still had the temple worship going on, and you still had the lure of the Jewish traditions, all of those things that surrounded temple worship and what it meant to be Jewish. You had all of that surrounding you every day of your life. And to be a Christian and to be Jewish during that period of time was hard. A lot of them lost their lives because they were Christians. They lost their houses. They lost their stuff. They were left destitute. Many of them were, because they were Christians. It was a very unique period of time. When you track through there, Acts chapter 2, we'll say it occurs around AD 30 or so. At that point in time, as soon as the church was established and these Jews became Christians, I would say that none of them ever questioned whether or not they should continue to keep the law of Moses. They all continued to keep the law of Moses because they felt like they should. In their own mind, that was something that had to keep on happening. And so for a number of years, they continued to do that. And until about 11 years later, so what are we up to now? About 41 AD? You have the story of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. How was Peter thinking during that period of time? Well, he has the vision of this sheet that's let down with all of these animals, some of them unclean animals. And the voice, this is Acts chapter 10 and verse 13, the voice said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And he said, "No, by no means, Lord. I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Would it have been technically lawful for him to have eaten pig meat, like the day after Pentecost? Yeah, it would have been lawful, except that it would have certainly violated his conscience. And none of the Jews would have even thought about that. For 11 years, thousands and thousands of Jews, they never thought about eating anything unclean. Peter said, "I never have." The voice came to him again in verse 15 and said, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once into heaven. And then Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean. He saw the vision, and he was very puzzled about that. He finally figured it out when these messengers from Cornelius came, and he went to Cornelius' household. He said, "Okay, I see what you're talking about. It's okay for me, a Gentile, or for me, a Jew, to go into the house of a Gentile. That's okay. I got it." Fast forward about 20 years later, in Acts chapter 15. I say 20 years later. This will be 20 years after chapter 2. So we're up to about AD 50, all right? And so we come to Acts chapter 15, and here we have what's called the Jerusalem Conference. And so Paul has gone out and Barnabas on that first missionary journey, and they're converting a lot of Gentiles. And when they come back and the Jewish brethren find out about that, some of them, in chapter 15, Acts 15 and verse 5, some of them, they belonged to the party of the Pharisees. They rose up and said, this is not right. It is necessary, they said, to circumcise those Gentiles and to order them to keep the law of Moses. Well, you know how that played out. Peter and James and Paul and the elders at Jerusalem, they all said, no, that's not required. But they're talking about the Gentiles. What were the Jews back in Jerusalem? Even Jewish Christians, what were they doing? Well, they were still doing all that stuff. They were still doing the circumcision. They were still doing the law of Moses. 28 years after Acts chapter 2, let's fast forward here now to Acts chapter 21. And so this is like 28 years later. So where are we now? 30 and 28, so 58 AD. 58 AD. We're like 12 years away from the destruction of Jerusalem. Paul has just completed his third missionary journey. He comes back to Jerusalem, probably carrying that load of cash that he received from all of these churches. Remember the collection for the needy saints back in Jerusalem? He brought that to them. And he gave them a report about all the Gentiles that were being converted out here in the Mediterranean world. And in verse 20, let's take it up. We're in Acts chapter 21, starting in verse 20. When the Jerusalem elders heard the report, they glorified God. They said, that's good. But then they said to Paul, but you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. Isn't that what we're talking about? Jewish Christians. Thousands of them. And they are all zealous for the law. Their attitude is, we got to keep doing the law thing. But they've been told about you, Paul, that you're teaching all the Jews out there among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. You're telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to our customs. So what are we to do? They will certainly hear that you have come to town. And so do what we ask you here. We have 4 men who are under a vow. This is a very Jewish thing. They were under a vow. Take these men, purify yourself along with them, pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and all will know, all of the Jewish brothers here in Jerusalem will know that there is nothing to what they have been told about you, but that you yourself live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have already sent a letter. Going back to Acts chapter 15. We've already sent a letter out. The Gentiles, we know the Gentiles don't have to do all this. But these Jewish brothers, they're still doing this. And they think that maybe you don't like the law of Moses anymore. And you know what Paul did? He said, sure, I'll do that. And so he joined in paying for the vows of these guys. Fast forward to the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews, what's that about? Well, it's about Jewish Christians who were in danger of falling back into Judaism. Scholars place the book of Hebrews around 65 AD, which would be like 35 years after Acts chapter 2, after the establishment of the church. Only a few years before the destruction of Jerusalem. And some of these Jewish Christians were saying, you know what, we're done with this Christianity thing. We're going to go back to the way it was. We're done with Christianity. We're going to just go back and let's just do the Jewish thing totally. And the Hebrew writer pleads with them, please do not go back. Do not cast away your confidence, which has a great reward. Hebrews chapter 10. And of course, you know, I'm sure, what happened in 70 AD, 40 years after the establishment of the church, the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus prophesied of it in Matthew chapter 24 and in verse 1. When Jesus left the temple, his disciples came to point out to him all the buildings of the temple. It was one of those whoa kinds of things. Wow, these are awesome. Herod was still in the rebuilding process of this great temple. His answer, you see all of these? Truly I say unto you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. 40 years later, those words came true. The temple was destroyed. The sacrifices ceased. A Jew has not been able to practice the law of Moses ever since, from that day until this, because there's no temple, there's no place of sacrifice, there's no Levitical priesthood. All of that was forcibly removed, forcibly destroyed in 70 AD. Were the Jewish Christians expected to keep the law of Moses? During that 40 years of time, God was okay with that. But finally, when it came 70 AD, God forcibly told them, we're done. From that time on, he fully expects the Jews and anyone else who would be a follower of Christ not to try to keep the law of Moses. That ain't how we're justified before God anymore. Good question.